we are in chapter 11.1. Our first objective is solve quadratic equation using the square root property. In order to do the square root property, we're going to follow the following steps. Step 1, you're going to isolate the squared expression. So whatever is being raised to the second power, you want to isolate it. Step 2, take the square root on both sides of the equation. And then step 3, solve the resulting equation. And of course, always step 4 is you can check your solution in the original equation. Okay, so it says solve. So we have 4x squared equals 49. So step 1 says isolate the expression that's being squared. So x is being squared, so you want to isolate x squared, which means you're going to divide both sides by 4. And now you have x squared equals 49 divided by 4. And then step 2 says take the square root on both sides of the equation. So you have x equals, now when we take the square root, remember there are two answers, plus or minus. Well, the square root of 49 over 4 is going to become 7 over 2. So x is going to be equal to positive 7 over 2 as well as negative 7 over 2. Alright, so solve. So now we have 3 times quantity x plus 2 squared equals 36. This time the squared expression is x plus 2 whole thing squared. So to isolate it, we're going to divide both sides by 3. And now we have x plus 2 whole thing squared equals 12. Now we take the square root on both sides of the equation. So the square and the square root cancel. So we're going to have x plus 2 equals plus or minus. Now we can simplify 12. Remember that is 4 times 3. So the square root of 12 is going to be the same thing as saying square root of 4 times the square root of 3, which is 2 square roots of 3. So this is x plus 2 equals plus or minus 2 square roots of 3. Now you need to solve for x, so subtract 2 on both sides. And you have x equals negative 2 plus or minus 2 square roots of 3. Okay, so now it's to solve. So we have 4x squared plus 9 equals 0. This time the squared expression is going to be x, so we have x squared. We need to isolate x squared, so the first thing we're going to do is subtract 9 on both sides. So now we have 4x squared equals negative 9. And then we're going to divide by 4. So we have x squared equals negative 9 divided by 4. So that's just step 1, isolating the square term. Now take the square root on both sides of the equation. So now we have x equals, remember plus or minus because we're taking the square root. Recall that when we see a negative inside the square root, the negative disappears, and on the outside is an I. And then the square root, so this is going to become I square roots of 9 over 4. And then the square root of 9 over 4 is the same as saying 3 over 2. So x is going to be equal to plus or minus 3 over 2 I. Alright, objective 2. It says complete the square of a binomial. If x squared plus bx is a binomial, then by adding b divided by 2 whole thing squared, a perfect trinomial will result. By adding b divided by 2 whole thing squared, you're able to factor the trinomial into the following: x plus b over 2 whole thing squared. Here's an example. It says, what term should be added to the binomial so that it becomes a perfect square trinomial? Write and factor the trinomial. So right now we have a binomial, two terms. So it says x squared minus 12x. Well, we are going to add the middle term divided by 2. So the middle term is negative 12. So do negative 12 divided by 2 whole thing squared. So this is going to become x squared minus 12x plus negative 6 squared, which is x squared minus 12x plus 36. So this is now your trinomial, and we can factor this as x plus negative 6 whole thing squared. Remember that you're going to factor it into the form x plus b over 2 whole thing squared. Well, this time b over 2 was equal to negative 12 divided by 2, which is negative 6. So we have x plus negative 6 whole thing squared. Another example, it says, what term should be added to the binomial x squared plus 10x so that it becomes a perfect square trinomial? Write and factor the trinomial. So we have x squared plus 10x plus, take the middle coefficient and divide by 2 whole thing squared. So this time it's going to be 10 divided by 2 whole thing squared, and we get x squared plus 10x plus 5 squared. So now we have x squared plus 10x plus 25. So this is the trinomial. Then when we factor it, we're going to use the 5, and we're going to write it as x plus 5 whole thing squared. Third objective, solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So now we're going to take completing the square and the square root property and combine them. So steps for solving quadratic equations by completing the square. Step 1, if the leading coefficient is not 1, divide both sides by this coefficient. So your leading coefficient has to be equal to 1. If it's not, divide both sides of your equation, so every term will be divided by that number. Step 2, isolate the variable terms on one side. If it has an x in it, keep it on the left side. If it does not have an x, move it to the right side. Step 3, complete the square. Remember, we complete the square by taking b divided by 2 whole thing squared. You're going to add this term on both sides of the equation. And then step 4, you're going to factor the perfect square trinomial. Remember, it will factor it as x plus b divided by 2 whole thing squared. So whatever the term is that you add on both sides of the equation in step 3, you will use it in step 4. And then step 5 says solve by applying the square root property. Remember, take the square root on both sides and solve the resulting equation. So it says solve by completing the square. So we have 2x squared plus 5x minus 3. Well, step 1 says that we need our leading coefficient to be equal to a 1. It is not, therefore we're going to divide every term by 2. And we end up with x squared plus 5 divided by 2x minus 3 over 2 equals 0. And then step 2 says isolate your x terms or your variable terms on one side. So we're going to move the negative 3 over 2 by adding 3 over 2 on both sides of the equation. So now we have x squared plus 5 over 2x equals 3 over 2. Now we're going to complete the square. Remember, complete the square by taking the middle coefficient and dividing by 2. So over to the side, it will be 5 over 2, so 5 halves, divided by 2, which is the same as saying 5 halves times a half, which is 5 over 4. So 5 over 4, whole thing squared. Whatever you add on the left side, you also have to add on the right side. So add or plus 5 divided by 4, whole thing squared. So again, remember you get this term by taking the middle coefficient, which is 5 over 2, and dividing by 2. It will come out to be 5 over 4, and then don't forget to square it. Since you add it to the left side of the equation, you must also add it to the right side of the equation. And then step 4 says to factor the trinomial. So to factor the left side, this will become x plus 5 divided by 4, whole thing squared. Remember, you factor your trinomial using the 5 over 4. So you just write it as x plus 5 over 4, whole thing squared. And we can simplify the right side to be 49 over 16. Square this, and that will become 25 over 16. And then add 3 over 2. So then step 5 was to solve using the square root property. So we have x plus 5 over 4, whole thing squared, equals 49 divided by 16. We're going to take the square root on both sides. So now we have x plus 5 over 4 equals plus or minus 7 over 4. Subtract 5/4 on both sides. So x equals negative 5 over 4 plus or minus 7 over 4. So go ahead and simplify out your final answers. The first one would be negative 5 over 4 plus 7 over 4. So negative 5 plus 7, which would be 2 over 4, which is a half. And then the second one would be negative 5 minus 7 all over 4. So that's negative 12 over 4, which is negative 3. Okay, so this will conclude our video for 11.1. Please email me if you have any questions.